This is Curaçao. Just a few steps from this shoreline, the ocean floor simply disappears. No gentle slope, no warning, just a line where shallow, sunlit water gives way to a drop of more than 300 meters into darkness. Hidden below that line, tucked inside a cave that appears on almost no map, is a pocket of water that glows cobalt blue without a single light source anywhere near it. On land, this place gets stranger still. No rivers, no natural lakes. For 4 centuries, a stretch of land smaller than 450 square kilometers has had almost no fresh water to sustain itself. And yet that same place became one of the most ethnically diverse, most resilient societies on Earth. The island sits exactly 65 kilometers off the coast of Venezuela. Its name is Curaçao. But what actually makes Curaçao remarkable isn't the cliffs, and it isn't the blue light hiding beneath the sea. It's how the people here learn to turn a barren rock into a place worth staying. To understand how, it helps to follow one ordinary day on the island, start to finish, dark to dark. Long before the sky changes color, water begins collecting in shallow cement cisterns on rooftops across the island, a habit so old that most residents perform it without thinking, topping off tanks fed by whatever rain fell the night before. Some homes still keep a second, older cistern buried beneath the yard, a relic from before piped water reached every neighborhood, kept in working order out of habit as much as necessity. There are no rivers on Curaçao, no natural lakes. Whatever the sky gives has to be caught, stored, and rationed, one roof at a time. A discipline passed down through every household on an island that was shaped less by rainfall than by fire. Volcanic rock pushed up from the seafloor millions of years ago, capped with coral too stubborn to hold water. That quiet morning routine is the first thing worth understanding about life here. Everything on this island begins with scarcity, and everyone has learned, without complaint, how to work around it. Down at the water's edge, that same discipline is already in motion, arriving by boat instead of by rain. Recognized today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Willemstad is where most islanders now live, work, and raise their families. Its architecture a layered record of everyone who ever passed through it. Dutch stepped gables sit beside Spanish-influenced arches. Iron balconies imported from Europe hang above streets that carry the rhythms of West Africa and Latin America in equal measure, and the sound of papiamentu. A language born on this island from exactly that mixture drifts from open windows and lunch counters alike, mixed with Dutch, Spanish, and English, sometimes all 4 inside a single conversation. At the lunch counters themselves, the same 2 dishes appear on nearly every plate. Queixinha, a whole shell of aged cheese stuffed with spiced meat and baked until it slumps at the center, and funchi, a firm cornmeal cake that plays the same steady, supporting role a rice or bread would elsewhere. Both dishes carry the island's whole story in miniature, built from whatever happened to be available, made to stretch further than it should. Because Curaçao remains part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, every islander is born holding a Dutch passport, free to study or work anywhere in Europe without asking permission from anyone. Many young people use exactly that freedom to leave for Rotterdam or Amsterdam the moment they finish school, chasing university degrees and salaries the island's small economy still struggles to match. Not all of them come back. It is one of the quieter costs of being this small. The same openness that once brought so many different people here now gives the newest generation an easy door to walk through in the other direction. Cutting straight through the middle of that same city runs the channel that decides how every one of these neighborhoods actually reaches the other. Small boats and water taxis cut across St. Anna Bay, carrying people to work, back and forth across a city that has never quite managed to become one. Regulars greet the ferry operators by name, exchange the same jokes they exchanged yesterday, and settle into seats worn smooth by years of the same short ride. Every ship that ever called at Curaçao, merchant vessel, slave ship, oil tanker, passed through this exact channel. Along both banks, pastel buildings rise straight from the water, their reflections breaking apart in the wake of the morning traffic. Along one of those same banks sits the oldest of the city's two halves, a neighborhood whose colors turned out to have a stranger origin than anyone might guess. Shopkeepers pull up their metal grates beneath facades painted yellow, coral, and deep blue, a striking departure from the whitewashed walls typical of Dutch colonial towns elsewhere. Punda is the oldest European settlement in the Western Hemisphere, still standing largely intact, and according to island legend, its color has nothing to do with taste. In the early 19th century, the story goes, the governor complained that glare from the white plaster gave him headaches and ordered every wall repainted in anything but white. True or not, the tradition endures, repainted every few years by residents proud to keep it going, arguing cheerfully over which shade of yellow belongs on which corner. Directly across the water, the other half of the city tells an entirely different story, not of merchants, but of everyone who worked for them. Its name means, quite literally, the other side. Otrobanda grew as a settlement for free laborers, craftsmen, and generations of working-class families who built the city's ships and hauled its cargo. Many of their descendants still live on these same narrow streets. By day, young residents are out repainting sections of the enormous murals that now cover entire building facades, spray cans rattling, radios balanced on window ledges, part of a street art movement that has turned old working-class walls into one of the most striking open-air galleries in the Caribbean. Older residents walking past these same murals remember a very different scene here on May 30th, 1969, when oil refinery workers protesting unequal wages marched into the city and the protest turned into a riot that burned parts of Punda to the ground. Curaçaoans still call it 30 de May, the 30th of May, and it changed more than just labor law. In its aftermath, Afro-Curaçaoan political leaders rose to power for the first time, and Papiamentu, the island's own Creole language, stopped being treated as something spoken only at home and started appearing in newspapers, classrooms, and government buildings, finally recognized as a language worth taking seriously rather than working around. By night, the same square fills for a very different reason. Plastic chairs are dragged out, and a projector screen goes up against a mural wall, the same ritual repeated in bars and living rooms across the island. With a population of roughly 156,000, Curaçao became the smallest nation ever to qualify for a Men's World Cup, and this summer, nobody here needed reminding of it. A week earlier, the team had been beaten 7-1 by Germany, a scoreline that would humiliate almost anyone. The island celebrated anyway, simply for having been on that field at all. Tonight, the crowd is packed shoulder to shoulder for the next match, against Ecuador, and goalkeeper Eloy Room, a veteran who signed on with the national side back when the idea of reaching a World Cup was barely a rumor, stops shot after shot, 15 of them by the final whistle, more than any keeper had managed in a single World Cup match in decades. The final score is 0-0, the first point Curaçao has ever earned at a World Cup, and the square erupts as if it were a championship. Strangers hug, someone climbs onto a parked car. For one night, a nation smaller than most cities on Earth is impossible to ignore. The two halves of this city are held together, quite literally, by a bridge unlike almost any other in the world. Commuters fall into a rhythm so familiar it barely registers anymore. Walk, wait while the bridge swings open for a passing ship, then walk again once it swings shut. Built in 1888, the Queen Emma Bridge floats on a line of pontoons, and small motors swing the entire span. Railings, lampposts and all, to one side whenever a vessel needs to pass. Locals call it the swinging old lady, a shared daily inconvenience that has, over more than a century, become part of how the city holds itself together. Leave the city behind entirely, and the island's dry, wilder interior opens up. The same land that shaped, and ultimately defeated, generations of hopeful farmers. Families still gather in the shade of the old landhouse buildings scattered through Cristofel National Park. Thick-walled plantation houses, their ochre plaster faded, once the administrative heart of failed sugar and aloe farms. Today they host picnics instead of overseers, the smell of grilled meat replacing the sounds of forced labor. Kids chasing each other around walls that once enforced very different rules. Around them stretches a forest found nowhere else in the Caribbean, columnar cacti rising several meters into the air, thorn trees bent permanently by decades of trade wind, and a small native owl that exists on no other island on Earth. Among the failed crops planted here centuries ago were Valencia orange trees, brought over by Spanish settlers hoping for sweet fruit. The dry soil and salt air twisted that plan completely. The oranges that grew were small, bitter, and nearly impossible to eat. For generations, they were treated as worthless and mostly left to rot on the branch. Then someone discovered that drying the peel released an oil unlike anything found in a normal orange, and what had been agricultural failure became blue curacao, an export now recognized on drink menus in cities that couldn't find the island on a map. It is, in miniature, the exact same trick the island has pulled again and again, taking whatever the land refused to give freely and turning it into something else entirely. Above that same failed farmland rises the reason most visitors come here in the first place. Conservation volunteers patrol this shore after dark, watching for sea turtles that haul themselves onto quiet sand pockets between the boulders of Sete Boca National Park to lay their eggs. Flashlights stay low and red, careful not to disturb the animals mid-nest, voices dropping to almost nothing. There is no beach here in the ordinary sense, just a wall of volcanic rock meeting an ocean that has driven waves into this coastline, uninterrupted, for thousands of kilometers. This is the side of Curaçao no postcard shows, indifferent to whoever happens to be watching. Not far along that same coast, the tide puts on a performance that draws its own small crowd, timed by nothing but the moon. Local guides time their visits to exactly the right moment, the same way their parents once did, because the show only happens when the sea decides to perform. Beneath a shallow rise of limestone at Boca Tabla, the ocean has spent centuries hollowing out a hidden chamber. When a wave arrives, it forces its way in, compresses, and bursts back out through a narrow crack overhead, sending spray and a low roar into the air, a rhythm close enough to breath that older residents still speak of the coastline as something alive. A short distance further along this same unforgiving shoreline, another opening in the rock makes a very different sound. One fisherman turned into something almost as useful as a clock. Older fishermen still listen for it before heading out, a sharp, concussive crack, loud enough to carry for hundreds of meters, produced when a swell forces itself through a narrow crack in the coastal rock, at a place locals call Boca Pistol, the mouth that fires like a gun. Long before weather apps existed, the timing and intensity of that sound told generations of sailors exactly what kind of sea was waiting for them. Younger fishermen increasingly check their phones instead, but the habit of reading the coast this way hasn't disappeared entirely. It survives in the older hands, still teaching it to their sons and daughters, one boat trip at a time. Inland, from this same violent coast, hidden beneath the dry hills, is where the island's very first residents chose to disappear. Local guides lead small groups through the limestone chambers of Hato caves, many of them repeating stories they first heard from their own grandparents long before it became a job. Stalactites that took tens of thousands of years to form hang from vaulted ceilings, and shafts of light break through cracks overhead, illuminating faint carvings left by the Caquetío, an indigenous people who lived here long before any European ship reached the horizon. Bats stir faintly overhead as the group passes, wings rustling somewhere in the dark beyond the flashlight beams. Centuries later, the same caves sheltered people who had escaped slavery, vanishing into passages too dark. Not far from those same caves, just offshore, the seafloor performs a disappearing act of its own. Dive instructors load their boats from docks that barely existed a generation ago, part of an industry that now employs thousands of islanders who grew up swimming these same waters as children. A few dozen meters from shore, the seabed simply stops, shallow coral and pale sand giving way, almost without warning, to a wall dropping hundreds of meters into darkness, a line divers call the Blue Edge. Parrotfish graze along the upper ledge, indifferent to the abyss just beneath them. For the families who now make a living guiding tourists along it, the reef is less a natural wonder than an inherited trade, cousins training cousins on top of the same volcanic geology that once made this island nearly impossible to farm. Some of those same divers now carry a second tool alongside their cameras, a small spear, reserved for lionfish, a striped, venomous species with no natural predator in these waters that has been quietly devouring native reef fish for years. Rather than simply killing them and moving on, local divers began handing their catch straight to restaurant kitchens in Willemstad, where chefs discovered the meat was mild, flaky, and, once the venomous spines were removed, entirely safe to eat. An invasive threat to the reef turned, almost by accident, into one of the freshest items on the island's dinner menus. One more example of Curaçao simply refusing to let anything go to waste. Hidden somewhere along that very same drop-off is a chamber most divers only ever hear about secondhand. Sunlight enters through a submerged crack in the limestone, refracts through the water, and floods a hidden chamber from underneath. The same cobalt glow described in the island's oldest diving stories, passed from one generation of guides to the next. There is no artificial light here, no filter, no trick of a camera. Divers who slip in after dark with underwater lights still catch traces of that same impossible blue, glowing faintly from a crack that has never needed anyone's permission to exist. That same volcanic geology and the deep water it created just off this coast is the entire reason a hidden bay behind the city became worth fighting over in the first place. Container ships and oil tankers ease into this bay every week, guided by pilots whose grandfathers likely worked these same waters. Tucked behind a narrow channel, Kattegat is one of the largest natural deepwater harbors in the Western Hemisphere, so completely enclosed by land that it stays calm no matter what the open sea outside is doing. A stillness sailors have relied on for 4 centuries, long before anyone thought to measure it. For an island with nothing to farm, this harbor was worth more than any field. When Dutch traders arrived in the 17th century, they saw exactly what it offered: a secure base to control shipping across the entire Caribbean, and, for far too long, a secure base for something far darker. What that harbor made possible, for far too long, is remembered in full inside a museum built on the exact ground where it happened. A line of schoolchildren shuffles into a cool stone courtyard, backpacks bumping against each other, voices dropping to a whisper the moment they cross the threshold. Nobody has to tell them to be quiet here. This is the Curaçao Museum, built directly on the ground where a slave market once stood. A pair of iron shackles hangs at exactly a child's eye level. A scale model of a slave ship shows human bodies packed in with barely room to turn, and more than one student stops walking entirely when they see it, hand quietly reaching for a friend's sleeve. Further inside, the exhibits pull back further still. To the kingdoms of West Africa the captives were taken from, to the drums, the fabrics, the craftsmanship that existed whole and thriving before any of it was violently interrupted. For these students, none of this is someone else's story. It's the first stop toward understanding exactly where their own last names come from, and, for many of them, it's the moment history stops feeling like a subject and starts feeling like family. A short walk from that same museum stands a monument to the one man who refused to accept the story being written for him. Ask almost any child on the island who this bronze figure is, and the answer comes back instantly, proudly, like a fact they've always known: Tula. In August of 1795, more than 1,000 enslaved people rose up against their captors under his leadership, coordinating across multiple plantations at once, one of the largest uprisings in the history of Dutch colonial slavery. The revolt was crushed. Tula was captured, tortured, and executed. Slavery here would continue for nearly 7 more decades. And yet somehow his name never disappeared. It survived the very system that killed him. Every July 1st, the island shuts down offices and opens streets for Emancipation Day. Drums and dancing filling the same squares where obedience was once enforced by force. Tula isn't taught here as a tragic footnote. He's taught as proof that this island, even at its lowest point, refused to stay broken. The end of that system would eventually come, not through rebellion, but through an entirely different kind of arrival, one made of oil instead of chains. Older residents in the neighborhoods nearest the old Royal Dutch Shell refinery can still describe the smell that used to hang over their childhood evenings, a smell many say they oddly miss because it meant steady work. Built in 1915 to process Venezuelan crude, the refinery once employed tens of thousands of workers drawn from across the Caribbean and left behind something that still defines the island more than any monument. One of the most ethnically diverse populations anywhere in the region, families who arrived from a dozen different islands chasing the same paycheck and never left. That same refinery is where the anger of 1969 first caught fire, when subcontracted workers, paid far less than their Dutch-managed colleagues for the same labor, finally refused to accept it. The strike that began at these gates spread into the city within hours. The refinery itself has sat largely idle since 2019, its future still argued over in government offices, leaving thousands of descendants of those original workers waiting to see whether it will ever fully restart. Long before any of that industry existed, though, this same coastline already depended on a far older, far simpler kind of exchange, one that still happens every single morning. Wooden boats glide into St. Anna Bay before sunrise, hulls low under the weight of mangoes, plantains, and peppers carried across the sea from Venezuela, just 65 kilometers away. Ice clinks in coolers, a radio somewhere plays low, and the smell of ripe fruit reaches the quay before the boats themselves finish tying off. Vendors call out from the decks as the first customers arrive at the stone quay, haggling in the easy back-and-forth rhythm of papiamentu, the same exchange their grandparents once made, and their grandparents before them. This floating market has operated in some form for generations, quietly outlasting colonial rule, economic collapse, and, more recently, the political tension that has made trade between the two countries increasingly uncertain. Some mornings, fewer boats arrive than the last. So far, they have kept coming. Those same small boats, and every ship before them, have always had to answer to one place above all, the harbor at the heart of everything. Dock workers start their shifts as the light turns gold, boots ringing against the same stone quays their ancestors once crossed in chains. Ropes creak, gulls circle for scraps. Someone laughs over the hiss of a coffee thermos being passed hand to hand. In this hour, it is easy to see only the postcard version of Willemstad's harbor. The boats, the breeze, the water catching fire with the sunrise. For close to 2 centuries, thousands of men, women, and children were unloaded onto these exact stones, held in warehouses a few footsteps from where the coffee is now poured, before being shipped onward in chains. It's a history most islanders learn early, not whispered but spoken about plainly, the way you'd talk about a scar everyone in the family shares. Slavery wasn't abolished here until 1863, among the last places in the region to let it go. And yet, every single morning, these same stones fill again, with the next shift, the next handshake, the next thermos of coffee passed hand to hand. Curaçao was never given fertile soil, or rivers, or an easy path to survival. It was given fire, salt water, and scarcity. And, generation after generation, its people simply kept showing up here anyway, at the water's edge, to see what could be made of whatever arrived. That, more than any cliff or any glowing blue cave hidden beneath the sea, is what actually amazes anyone who stays long enough to notice.